Hello, and welcome to my first tutorial that is going to be walking you through how to kind of become good at Scythe. I am a moderator of the online Discord community for playing Scythe through Tabletop Simulator, and I've played a lot of this game. I think it's probably one of the best board games ever made. I still absolutely love it after well over 100 playthroughs at this point. Expansions or not, the game is absolutely excellent. And so some people in the community asked me to help make a series of videos to, potentially help clean up their game and maybe make their engines a little bit more efficient and, you know, hopefully maybe win in a couple tournaments because it is a game that does appear at tournaments fairly often nowadays. And so I hope you'll find this useful. So for this first video, I thought I would go over some of the main elements that each faction brings to the table, their faction abilities, their mech abilities, and general strategies they want to go through, which will not necessarily look at specific player boards, not the player mats. Rather, I'll be looking at what synergizes well with the faction in terms of their home peninsula, their starting location, as well as their innate abilities, the one faction ability plus their specific mech abilities. Each faction does have a slightly different playstyle, although they all are very flexible. And so in the second half of this video, I will look at the player mats and explain what is a good strategy for each player mat, which obviously is going to be a little bit complicated because not every faction synergizes extremely well with every player mat, so it requires a little bit of nuance. And so that's hopefully what we'll find interesting and valuable here. For most of the graphics for this, I've been using the Scythe Digital Edition, which was made by Asmodee Games in conjunction with Stonemaier Games. I think they do a pretty good job at representing the game visually, and so I'll be using graphics from their game to, detail what I am doing. So I thought I would start off discussing the 5 factions that come with the base game, and I will also look at the 2 other factions that came with Invaders from Afar, but they will be towards the end of the video. And I thought alphabetically, there's a good place to start, so Crimea is the winner. Starting with Crimea, the largest and most important element to consider when you are playing as Crimea is their faction ability. Coercion. Once per turn, you may spend 1 combat card as if it were 1 resource. So that means that if you are going to spend metal to create a mech, you could spend 1 less than you need to and spend instead a card to make up for that 1 missing resource. Now you might be thinking, well, cards are really important. Combat is very valuable to me as Crimea, as it is to everyone, and spending those cards is not necessarily worth it. But something to consider is every time you use a card, you're saving yourself a resource. If you already have that resource, then you've essentially earned yourself points instead of a card. Cards are not worth points at the end of the game, but resources do gain you bonus points based on the popularity track. So every resource that you hold on to is more points. And so if you're able to spend cards as an alternative to spending resources, you're essentially making yourself earn more points. Alternatively, you can also consider the fact that you are making your engine very efficient. If you only have so many workers, and typically a typical strategy seems to be 5 workers for the first portion of the game, well then you can only get 5 resources per produce. Unless you are doing trades in the middle of your actions, 5 resources is typically not enough to create a steady engine of every turn doing a bottom row action. But if you factor in the fact that you might have 2 cards for every actions, now those 5 resources, or 2 cards for every other action, one card for every other action, then you factor in that to make those 5 resources effectively 7 resources, and most of the time you will be spending 4 on one and 3 on another. So now you can afford those without upgrades and without getting out your more expensive workers. So that faction ability is essential. The more you use it, the better you're doing. You do have to play it a little safe though, because if you're only drawing 4s and 5s, you're in like a good and bad place. Your economics game is going to be a little bit muddled because you don't necessarily want to spend those 4s and 5s. However, your combat-related game and your board presence is potentially very high. You can play much more aggressive when you've got 4s and 5s because you are feeling good about winning those combats. Some of Crimea's other notable abilities are their Wayfare and their Scout mech. I'm going to start with Scout because it's probably the more important of the two. Before combat, steal one of the opponent's combat cards at random. That is another one of the most strong faction abilities, specifically mech abilities in the game. Combat cards, as we know, minimize at 2 power, maximize at 5 power. So by stealing a card, sure, if you steal a 2 from somebody who's got a lot of cards, you're not really doing anything to them. So you'd probably rather have one of the faction abilities that reduces the opponent's power or generates more power for you. But if you steal a 3, you've done more than that. If you steal a 4, you've done very well. And if you steal a 5, you have given yourself a substantial advantage. The chance of your opponent having more than 1 5 is low, and then that also increases your power essentially by the same amount. Not to mention, this gives you a way to kind of milk opponents for cards. You can go in, do a combat, steal a card. Now you've got that to use with your coercion ability later, and maybe you don't go for the combat full at hand. Maybe yours already somebody who's gotten both their combat cards, and you can go and attack them just to steal a card and use it to spend for resources later. It's like an automatic stealing of resources to an extent without having to win the combat. And then you might even, as a perk, win a combat. So if you've got a 5 and you're like, oh man, I don't want to spend this, go fight somebody. Steal a card, get not a 5, spend the 5 to win the combat, get yourself a star, and you've got the card to spend as well. So Scout has strong synergy with them, and it's a strong ability on its own. Wayfare. In 1 through 5 player games, Wayfare allows you to move to a territory or home base, move from a territory or a home base to your home base or that of any inactive faction. So many factions have teleport abilities, and I would say this is probably the weakest of them. Most teleport abilities allow you to mobilize onto the board. This allows you to mobilize around the outside of the board, and specifically to locations that aren't being used. So that is a complexity. Not to mention, it takes one movement to get to a home base, and it takes another movement to get off of it. You obviously don't want to stay on home bases because you cannot deploy on them, you cannot spend resources from them, you cannot trade onto them, you cannot build on them. So it's useful for small player accounts to potentially go nab those last few encounters, or to spread out and acquire territories that other people aren't going to go for. But other than that, it's fairly weak. In high player count games, in 6 or 7 player count games, this becomes a different version of Wayfare, where all unoccupied farms, so food generating hexes, you can move to. I would argue that this is not a benefit. This is not an improvement. Mainly because in higher player count games, there are very seldomly farms that are unoccupied. Everybody's trying to spread out. Everybody's trying to acquire location, like a home. Sometimes you can jump in behind a faction that accidentally vacated a farm, such as Polonia's farm, or you can also jump into those 2 little farms that are over by Rusviet and Nordic. But I would say that mech is often when you leave towards the end, unless you're going for a non-centrally board-focused strategy. So those are Crimea's main faction abilities. Let's take a look at their board position and discuss what that means for your opening turns. So here we have Crimea's starting board position. They are one of the few home bases that actually is adjacent to 3 territories, although one is a lake, and that is not useful at all to Crimea. They are also adjacent to a farm and a village. This is one of the strongest starting locations, probably the second strongest starting location of all factions. Let's talk about why. So for one, Crimea has a worker start on a village. This means that if you want to generate more workers as soon as possible, which is always a good idea because the more workers you have early, the more times your later produces generate even more resources going forward. So a lot of workers early means a lot of efficiency of your later produces. So the fact that you don't have to take a move action to relocate your workers onto a village before you can generate more workers is essentially one extra action Crimea gets over many of the other factions. So that is not something you should disregard. The other reason why this starting position is extremely strong is that the other worker is on a farm. Food is vital to Crimea. As we already discussed, coercion, having factory cards is essential. Having combat cards is essential. And so you want to consider, how am I going to get those combat cards? And the most efficient way to generate combat cards is through the enlist action. When you enlist, you can choose to gain 2 combat cards immediately as one of the bonuses to the enlist, but you can also choose to uncover the enlistment bonus that is tied to the enlist action. Now, whenever you enlist again, your 2 neighbors enlist, you generate an extra card. And since enlistment generates free resources on other people's turns, it is often an action that people go for, even if it is not coin generating. And so you want to consider that as probably your first bottom row action. Getting that enlist to get that card generating enlistment bonus plus the 2 card starting bonus from enlisting. This will give you those 2 cards that can make your engine more efficient, and it also will generate more cards for you as earlier on, and thus will essentially generate for you. It'll essentially generate for you more resources. And so that's the biggest thing to consider. Making workers early, getting your first enlist as soon as possible. An added benefit to Crimea's starting position is the fact that on their home peninsula, they have metal. Metal means mechs, and mechs mean mobility. So beyond having a resource they care very, very deeply about, food, and beyond having a worker start on a village, which means a more efficient beginning, they also can get mechs without leaving their home base. And that is a viable, very, very important ability. So a typical start for Crimea will involve a produce, probably a trade for a couple extra food, an enlist if you can, and then maybe a second produce before you start to move to try and get onto that metal and perhaps go for that encounter. That is almost always going to be part of your opener. Produce, trade, look for that first enlist, whether it means producing again or going for it right away. Excellent. So up next, we are going to be talking about Saxony, the Saxony Empire. In true German form, this faction is mostly based on winning combats as much as possible, being the aggressive ones in the game. This is mostly based on their faction ability, Dominate. Whereas every other faction is limited to only 1 star per column for both the objective track as well as the war track, right? Saxony is allowed to get as many stars in either track as they'd like. Now, there is a theoretical limit there. With the objective track, you can only place 2 stars because you only get 2 objectives. There is a degree of moderation that can happen to this based on which expansions you're using, but Saxony acquiring only 2 stars on objective tracks is effectively the limit. However, being able to acquire unlimited stars on the combat track means that Saxony, more than any other faction, has the potential to end the game in the most unexpected and early ways. This doesn't seem like much, but if they're not going for a popularity track, if they're trying to limit other players' scores, they can potentially go for several combat victories in a single turn to burst them up from maybe 2 or 3 stars to 6 with ease. Now you might think, how is this possible? And really, it's based in their mech abilities, which make this faction what it is. Their single strongest mech ability, I would say, is their underpass ability. This allows them to move between any mountain that they control and any tunnel, and it technically means they can move between 2 different mountains they control as well. And since they control a mountain right next to their home base, this effectively means in any single movement turn, provided they have the speed mech, they can go from their home base to any tunnel on the board. And tunnels are extremely viable positions for every faction. So the chances of them being able to engage in a combat at any given moment is near 100%. When you combine this with their disarm ability, which reduces their opponent's power by 2 if they're fighting on a tunnel, they can always have an advantage in these combats, which means even if they go for a fight, they can lose and then come back in for another fight and have a strong potential once again. And since they are mostly fighting on tunnels, that ability does come up often. But something that is overlooked about Saxony in their mechs is actually their Riverwalk ability. Riverwalking to metal and wood means that they can enter almost every single other faction's home base through one means or another. They can Riverwalk to metal to enter Crimea's home base. They can Riverwalk to wood to enter Polonia's home base. Nordic is unfortunate enough to have both of those, and so can be attacked both ways by Saxony. The only faction that is immune to this is Rusviet, which is one of the reasons why Rusviet is one of the stronger factions in the game, is that they cannot be preyed upon at home by Saxony, who is the one to most likely do so. So even in the event that a Saxony is that other players are playing safely against the Saxony can likely still prey upon them, if not through a single move from their home base, through a single move from almost anywhere else on the board, or two different moves from their home base. So Saxony is definitely about combat. So if you're into the mind game that is combat and Scythe, trying to predict whether they'll go low or high, or just trying to play the odds as often as possible, Saxony can definitely win that way. The problem is that if you go for repeated combats, you end up draining your resources of combat. So less cards, less power, and less threat, unfortunately. So Saxony is definitely a higher skill faction, especially for going for this rapid early game win. I think the fastest I've ever seen a Saxony end the game is somewhere around turn 9 or 10, with 6 stars and 0 popularity. So Saxony's starting position is also very important to their playstyle. They start with a worker on a metal, and they start with a worker on an oil. This is one of the most flexible starts for any faction. The reasoning for that is that metal is highly important to getting your first mechs, and your first mechs means repositioning yourself to where you want to be faster. If you get that speed mech before you take your first move action, then in your first move, your character can get the encounter, which is great. If you get a different mobility mech, say Riverwalk, you can reposition your workers somewhere that they need to be outside of your home peninsula very early. And also, as we already discussed, their underpass ability means repositioning their workers to any specific resource hex on the board, because there is at least one of each on the tunnels, meaning they have the most flexibility in terms of repositioning themselves for their own benefit. But also oil. Oil means upgrades, and upgrades mean a more efficient engine. Now, it is not very typical for a faction to try and finish off an upgrade track. The reason for that is that it takes 6 bottom row actions rather than 4, and action economy is extremely important to winning Scythe. And so, starting with oil and getting an early upgrade, while it might not mean getting that star from upgrading, it does mean that, I can optimize my engine so that I can get this economy. I can get maybe more power or more movement very, very early, and those I can use to fuel my combat-related strategy. And so you want to consider perhaps not moving your workers to get to the village to get more workers early on, but rather going for those things, producing for metal, producing for oil, having one of each, and then flexibly perhaps trading for whichever one you need more of. If you have an upgrade that costs 3, and a deploy that costs 3, well then you're in a really great spot. You can produce, you can trade for one of each. Then you can produce again, and now you've got 3 of each. So you've got your first mech and your first upgrade done within your first, 4 or 5 turns, right? Even if your mech costs 4 and your oil and your upgrade only costs 3, you can still upgrade before you deploy to reduce the cost of that mech to 3, and you can still afford it. So there's a lot of situations where that is what you'd like to do. even in the situation where upgrades don't get you coins, they make your overall engine effective, which is a great thing. And like I said, that first mech to reposition to and to establish board presence, perhaps get that factory card is extremely nice for Saxony. Having a factory card means moving 2 turns in a row, which means attacking and then coming back in and attacking again. You go in once, they see that you're trying to go for a combat related victory, they spend a lot of power, you underspend, then you come back the second time. You come back the second time, now they've spent everything, they're weak, and you can then get that star, right? So Saxony has a lot of strength in moving twice, and so a factory card early is extremely important, and thus that early mech to leave home and get where you need to go is cannot be overlooked. Continuing our clockwise movement around the board, we get to the Polonia Republic. So, Polonia is very, very focused on kind of a gamble to an extent, right? And that is because of their faction ability, Meander, right? When their character gets to an encounter tile and they draw their encounter card, rather than picking just one option, they pick 2. And what's better is that they pick them and use them in the order they would like. So they can pick the top row action to get extra popularity that they can then spend to do the bottom row of spend popularity to get the bonus, right? And so this means that Polonia can essentially roll the dice, so to speak, in their early strategy, right? If they want to go for an early strategy which involves trading for their mechs, that's great. Or they can roll the dice and say, if I get my mech through this encounter, then I can be more cost efficient with doing maybe enlists early or buildings early. And so when playing Polonia, there's always that bit of a gamble, right? Am I going to go for the definitive options, which is building or enlisting, as we'll talk about with their starting position, or am I going to go for the gambled or perhaps even trading for a mech, or am I going to gamble a bit with what I get in my encounter? A Polonia's game can be made or broken based on the Meander ability. If you go for this effective, this trading for a mech choice, and maybe you get your speed mech or your submerge mech or whatever it is, and then you get a second mech off of the encounter, now you're looking like you're in a very, very good spot. And so Polonia really cares about getting speed early and being able to leave their home territory early to take advantage of that faction ability as often as possible. It's not uncommon. It's very common for Polonia to get at least 3, if not 4, 5, or I've even seen 6 encounters on a Polonia in a game. How is that possible? Well, let's look at their mech abilities. Riverwalk for Polonia is nothing special. Crossing the metal is good. Crossing to villages is actually very good. Both of those have certain locations that will get them a encounter that otherwise wouldn't be there. They can riverwalk from 3 different tunnels directly onto an encounter. So they can riverwalk from the tunnel near Crimea onto Crimea's encounter. They can riverwalk from the tunnel near Saxony onto Saxony's encounter, and they can riverwalk from either of the tunnels near Nordic onto Nordic's encounter. And so that synergizes very well with their Meander ability. But really what does this for them is the submerge ability. They can teleport between lakes. They can enter a lake, take 1 movement to go from that lake to any other lake. And so that means that they can really jump across the board in ways that are completely unexpected, right? You synergize that with a factory card, then you have maybe a 3 movement speed. You can essentially move almost anywhere in the board because adjacency to lake is true for almost every location, few excepting. So being able to move onto a lake, move to another lake, and come off that lake means that you can get very, very many encounters. And that is not an uncommon Polonia strategy. Get your an early mech, maybe submerge. If you can ideally get 2 early mechs from benefits from the encounter, then you get submerge and speed. Then you immediately get to the factory because they do benefit from being slightly closer to the factory than most other factions. And that means that they can get to that factory. Getting to the factory early is huge because the factory card's top row can also help fuel efficient game for you. But Polonia is much more concerned with the fact that every single factory card allows you to move one unit 2 spaces, and if you have speed, that means 3. So that's what a typical Polonia strategy is. Now, another thing that allows Polonia to really make a game is their camaraderie mech, right? In combat, do not lose popularity when forcing an opponent's workers to retreat. So a little caveat I want to specify is that most people think of this as anytime I force an opponent's workers to retreat, I do not lose popularity, but it does explicitly say in combat. So if you just kick off a standard worker just sitting alone with no combat unit on it, you still lose that popularity. But it does mean that no one is safe from you. You don't care if they have a very important place with a mech piled up with 8 workers as a deterrent from attack. You can still do that. So Polonia can always look for that easy prey regardless of their position. That easy prey, oh sure, that easy prey, but they've got 4 or 5 workers, which is such a popularity deterrent to everyone else. Polonia doesn't care. And so when you're playing Polonia, you want to look for those opportunities. Oh, they have 5 or less power, and I've got 7 or more, and they are in a position I can get to, which typically they are because of your submerge, your speed, and hopefully your factory card as well, plus the camaraderie. They are a vulnerable person to me. So always consider that as Polonia. That's a very common last star, especially if you can find this person who's generated all of their workers and perhaps is sitting on a pile of resources. They might think these resources are safe because nobody is willing to spend, 5 or 6 or 7 popularity to get these resources. Polonia is not spending that. Remember that. One of Polonia's biggest weaknesses is their starting peninsula. It is widely regarded that the build bottom row action is substantially weaker than the other options. Upgrade makes an engine more efficient. Deploy gives you mechs, which allows you to achieve combat stars and board positioning and repositioning. Enlist gives you benefits on your and other people's turns. Build can help. Building a mill means more resources. Building a monument means more popularity. Building a mine potentially means more mobility, right? But ultimately, most of those things are outclassed by something else. The monument, for example, is equivalent to a single upgrade, right? And that upgrade is also making something cheaper at the same time, so it's better. The mine is mostly equivalent to mobility, which can be acquired in 2 of your mechs, right? The mill is, counts as an extra worker and an extra produced territory, but same thing. You can do an upgrade for an extra produced territory and it simultaneously make a bottom row cheaper. So it is outclassed, which is why starting on wood is always a bit of an awkward spot. But since Polonia has no metal on their home peninsula, they do have a slight need for that wood to potentially get that mine to get off of their home peninsula at all. And so when you're playing Polonia, your first choice is often, do I want to rely on trading for a mech? Do I want to rely on generating wood for a mine? Do I want to rely on maybe both? Or do I want to risk it in both cases and go for that enlist and get that encounter? And ultimately, the decision you make is going to be based on, how much you think you need to roll those dice to get the most efficient start, as well as, what your neighbors are going to do. An early enlist that's going to generate you some power to get a star there or some popularity to really race your way up to the top can be very, very vital. As well as generating cards is valuable because oftentimes factory cards, which you intend to get, are fueled off of combat cards. So there's a lot of reason why enlist is a good option. There's also a lot of reason why build is a good option. And there's also potential for neither, and that you just go for the trades for metal so that you can get it a deploy off, as well as move both of your workers onto the village to maybe burst forth with a lot of workers. I would generally advise against that strategy, but I've seen it done, and I've seen it work. So that's the biggest thing to consider. As I already mentioned, their starting position is awkward, and there's a lot of the dice rolling and kind of gambling as to what you're going to get. And if you get what you need, then you can really accelerate your game. The good news is that oftentimes Polonia is flexible in what they can need, so to speak, right? If they get to the encounter and the encounter gives them a lot of wood, well, then they can build regardless of what they did with their worker. If it gives them a lot of metal, well, then they can deploy regardless of whether they've been trading. If it gives them straight a mech, great. Now they can use that to move away and onto the factory soon. It gives them straight a structure. They can put the mine down and use it to go through to generate more workers or get off their home peninsula. And if it gives them any X amount of, choose 2 resources, which is not uncommon, then they can choose those things and have even more option. So it's not unlikely that Polonia will get what they need, but there is always a chance you don't. A game on Polonia where your options are to get power, the 3 options are power and combat cards related or popularity related, then you're in a weird spot. Upgrades even can work to an extent, because if you get these upgrades, then you can generate, make the actions you need to do cheaper, which means you can get to them more efficiently. So I'll be honest, I tend to roll the dice and go for that encounter as a risk when I play Polonia, but I've been beaten many times by people who play it safer and are more likely to get what they need, even if it takes an extra 2 turns to do so. So that's generally what I would advise. Go for the safe trades. Go for the safe producers of wood, wood or safe trades for metal, safe producers of wood. Get that structure, get that mech, whichever one you want to go for, or both. And then whatever you got the encounter is just a big boost to help you maybe skip a turn or 2 later on. Some of the fastest games I've ever seen outside of Saxony's going for 3 combat stars, 4 combat stars, are on a Polonia, because encounters can allow them to finish bottom row actions, get those stars on the board without ever having to use that precious action economy. Oh, I've done 3 enlists and haven't even taken that column yet, kind of thing. And so if you can find that option on Polonia, use it. Up next of the original 5 factions released with the game is the Nordic Kingdom. Nordic Kingdom is statistically, as it appears, the weakest of the original 5 factions, and that should not come as too much of a surprise when you consider their starting position. Their starting peninsula allows for some of the most efficient economy of all boards in the game, but since that economy does not include food, that means they're not getting those enlists. And as I've already established in talking about Crimea, enlist is probably the strongest of the bottom rows, because it is essentially free popularity, free coins, free cards, and free power, which are all balance out to end game position and end game score. And so there is that weakness to start off with, as well as the fact that there is no village in their home peninsula. No village in their home peninsula means that they can't make more workers except out of their home peninsula. And you might think, well, what do? They rely on their faction ability. Swim. Your workers may swim across rivers. They're allowed to cross rivers. Everyone else's workers can only cross rivers if carried by mechs. And so Nordic being able to move their workers across rivers means they, unlike most of their factions, have the potential to spread out to locations that they otherwise couldn't access just by taking move actions, right, without having to have mechs deployed. And so that is additionally changed a little bit by the fact that their home position allows for them to move to 2 different villages. So there's a little bit of choice in their first movement in terms of do they want to reposition to one type of village or the other type of village, right? And when you're playing a game without invaders from afar, that choice is one that is important. It's oftentimes better in that circumstance to move towards the Albion and Polonia side, because there's a little bit more flexibility in movement from there. But if you are playing a game and an Albion is in the game, you are really pretty much pigeonholed, so to speak, into moving the workers the other way. And that can create awkward situations for you. So before we get into that, let's look at their mech abilities, because I will talk more about that worker movement and what makes it awkward. So Nordic is another thing that makes Nordic a little bit awkward is their mech abilities are possibly some of the weakest in the game. Their strongest, I would argue, is seaworthy. Like Polonia, they can move on to lakes. Unlike Polonia, they cannot move between lakes. They cannot teleport. However, they have the best defensive ability in the game, where they do not have to retreat all the way home. They can retreat onto adjacent lakes, which means even in losing combat, they seldom are losing position on the board. And so they really like to hold valuable positions and perhaps even give them up with less of a fight than you might expect, because it means they can come back from directly adjacent on the very next turn. That's important. Being kicked off onto lakes and then coming back from that lake means that they are less concerned with losing combat than others outside of the star loss. But the downside is they have no strong movement. Speed is really it. They have no teleport, which is, I think they are the only faction of the base 5 factions that have no teleport. And when you consider the 2 Invaders from Afar factions have kind of modified teleport abilities, this is the only faction with no teleport. So it's not surprising that they have some serious movement weaknesses. You look at their other aggressive mech ability, which is artillery, and you might think, oh, there's some strength here, right? I have the option to reduce the opponent's power, but you have to pay a power to do so. It's more flexible than Saxony's in that it doesn't only apply in certain circumstances. You can use it wherever you'd like, but you're only gaining really a 1 power advantage. Now, there is something to be said when you are above 7 power, and that 1 power loss from you means nothing to you, right? Because you can maximize at 7. If you have 8 and you spend 1, your max doesn't change. If they are at 8 and they lose 2, their max changes. It goes down by 1. And so that's really where you want to look at using artillery, is using it to affect the opponent's maximum power they can spend, which can surprise them and allow you to win a combat that they didn't expect to lose. You also might want to use it as an opportunity to hurt opponents who are going for certain goals, right? You see an opponent going for a combat star, you can attack them, make them reduce their power, and then they have to decide, oh man, do I want to spend power and get the star for this combat and then forsake the combat star, or do I want to hold on and then give up this combat star and then maybe have to work against what was already lost for me to get that combat power star? And if you're the attacker and you can tie their combat max, then it's a win-win for you as Nordic to attack an opponent who is close to getting the combat power star. So look for those opportunities. Oh, somebody is sitting in an area I can reach, maybe on a tunnel or maybe near the factory, because Nordic often will hang out near the factory in the mid to late game. Well, attack them just to activate your artillery, and then if you can get that combat star, then it's kind of a twofold win. So think about that. So as I discussed earlier, the roughest part of playing Nordic is their home peninsula. Let's talk about the strengths of the home peninsula first. Starting on oil. I've already established with Saxony that starting on oil means a potential early upgrade, which means a potential very early efficient engine, right? And that is always a great thing. Finding those places where you can make your engine just efficient enough for your workers to pay for it, right? Or even generate additional resources than you need for given each produce means you're generating extra points and you can be more action efficient, right? As I established with Polonia, however, starting on wood is a bit weak. It's a bit weak. You are generating structures, which are the weakest of the bottom row actions you can take. Not to mention, you do not start on that food, and nor is there an easy way for you to get to food. You can swim across the one way, but then you've only got one worker, and you really rather have more than one. And since you'd have to move the workers individually, getting multiple workers onto that food is awkward. And by the time you do, now you're looking at a Rusviet potentially looking to get food themselves and a potential clash occurring there. So not getting that food means not getting the enlist, which means not getting long-term enlist bonuses, but also not enlisting the popularity bonus for building, which by the time you even start to get those enlist bonuses, you probably have already built once or twice even. And so there is a bit of awkwardness there. And then we can look at the idea of moving your workers after they're produced. If I get my workers on one of those villages, what now? My river walk is only to metal and to wood. So that puts me in an odd spot. If I move my worker towards the village that is next to Albion, then if I can produce a mech on that, I can move it right back to my home peninsula and really start to economy at home with very little enemy input. But I'm very unlikely to even have that opportunity. And Albion is almost certainly going to move a worker over to that village to establish it before they have to fight for it. And the chance that I go before them really relies on me drawing the industrial, perhaps even engineering board if industrial's not in the game. And so that's seldom an option. So the really only reliable option is to move the worker off the oil onto the village. But then there's other problems. My worker's no longer on oil. I don't get that early upgrade. And then if I get a mech out where I just produced a bunch of workers over on that right side there, I then have to move my mech all the way back to the metal, going through the farm, in order to get my workers home. So this presents a problem, you know? A common early move for a Saxony, for a Nordic, is to start going for that encounter and hopefully it gets you where you need to go, which might mean moving that worker from the wood onto the metal and moving your character onto the wood and perhaps going for that upgrade and that mech just like Saxony did. Or sometimes you do a little bit of a shuffle and you move both your workers over to the right. So you maintain one on the oil and you move one onto the village. Or if you're feeling really bold, you can even move that wood worker over to the oil that is on the mine and kind of spread out a bit. That way you can produce your first mech out of your home base through trading. So it's one of those ones that you really have to look at what board you have and how are you going to make it work. You know, that early building for a Saxony, perhaps that early building being a mill and essentially creating that new worker where you need it, has a lot of value. And if you're thinking about going for that mill and upgrade, then you can potentially make this work with very few workers, which might be what you have to do. So Nordic definitely is a bit complicated because of their low movement ability, their insufficient combat prowess, and their awkward starting position. So look for the board that works best with them. See if you can make an engineering board work with Nordic, you've gotten a good start. Now try to make a different one. Specifically awkward board for Nordic is probably the agricultural board, but even that can be done. So, the last of the 5 core factions that come with the base game Scythe is the Rusviet Union. And if ever there was a faction that had everything going for it, Rusviet is it. One by one, every single thing that it has going for it is extremely strong, extremely powerful. So let's look first at its faction ability. Relentless. You may choose the same section on your player mat as the previous turn. It is worth noting that this does not apply to factory cards. As much as that would make it very insanely good, it is still plenty strong with just this ability. Mainly what this means is that on their 3rd turn of the game, they can get their first star. Workers. They can produce. They'll generate 3 metal and all of their workers. Likely have a mech by that point and already have a star on the board. So there is some ridiculous synergy with their starting position, as well as having lots of workers, right? They can produce all 8 of their workers, put them on one spot, produce 8 of those resources, maybe do it again now, have 16, and then just go to that column, whatever it is they did, and just use those resources turn after turn until they finish that action. That is all there is to be said. You can't stop a Rusviet. Literally, you can't, because they can move, and then they can move, and then they can move, and then they can move. Which means that they can spread out towards the end of the game like nobody's business. It's very frequent that a Rusviet is not the faction to end the game, but is the faction to win the game. They see a faction is getting at their third, fourth, or fifth star, and they're like, game's about to end. Let me take a couple movements in a row and just spread out like crazy. Territory control at game end is the most important thing to do, which I will talk about in another video. And so being relentless is Rusviet's one of Rusviet's strongest abilities, but it is not their absolute strongest, which really makes things a little ridiculous. It's the combination of many abilities that are overly strong that makes Rusviet a bit overwhelming. Let's look at one of their mech abilities that adds to this onslaught of insanity. Township. Move between any village you control and the factory. You can just jump to the factory. That is unheard of. If a Rusviet wants to get to the factory first, they will get to the factory first, and you can't stop them. In the late game, just as I mentioned, they move a lot to spread out like crazy, and it's not difficult for them to be like, well, let me go ahead and try and take that factory back, just throw a couple mechs at it. You know, they can go for that combat, get a star there, acquire many more territories just by owning the factory. 3 more territories is a very significant number. And that potential to get the first pick of the litter of factory cards means they can go for that one that makes their engine more efficient. You know, if they produced all 8 of their workers, they can go for the one that lets them have the cheaper produce. If they need popularity, they can go for the one that turns combat cards or power into 2 popularity. Some of the strongest factory cards in the game. Not to mention if they are like, oh, it's awkward for me to get a specific resource, although honestly, besides wood, it really isn't for Rusviet. Then they could even go for a factory card that lets them do the bottom row tied to that resource. So, and also they can teleport between 2 different villages they control. So if they're out and around the board, they can teleport between villages. Which means if they're going encounter crawling, moving around the board, getting encounters, I can think of, I believe, 3 encounters that are on villages. They can go from one of those back to the factory, or all the way back home, provided they still control their home village. That mobility is insane. You also look at the fact that they can riverwalk 2 villages, means that they can go around that Polonia, Saxony area. There are 3 encounters all within 1 move of each other for Rusviet. And so there's a lot of potential for Rusviet to just shut down a game with board positioning and value. If that's not enough, we can look at their third mech, People's Army. In combat, where you have at least 1 worker, you may play 1 additional combat card. No other faction has anything even close to that. The power of that. Sure, you need a lot of combat cards to essentially use it to its highest degree, but that means you can engage in 2 different combats with, 3 or 2 or 3 combat cards in 1 turn, right? It's very seldom that you're attacking an enemy that has 3 entrenched combat units and need to use 3 combat cards to beat them, right? But being able to use 3 combat cards means you can spend cheaper combat cards, which you likely have many more of, in order to beat them. So you move 2 workers with 2 mechs with 1 worker, and then you move 1 mech with another worker. You can engage in 2 combats in 1 turn that you have a significant amount of upper hand in because of the fact that you've essentially moved 2 additional mechs. Those workers are essentially additional mechs. So that is a bit unheard of. The way Scythe balances defensive advantage is by allowing you to have 4 or 5 units in a territory, and then the enemy has to be able to beat 4 or 5 combat cards by only playing 3. Rusviet can even assault that because they can play 4 combat cards if they move 3 mechs and a worker using a upgraded move action. 4 combat cards versus 4 combat cards means the ties go to the attacker. It means Rusviet actually has the advantage. And if you have actually thought, I don't want to lose this by any means necessary, I'm going to move all 5 of my combat units, all 4 of my mechs and my character into one spot and have this 5-card advantage, then you've left your workers wherever they are unattended, and you're going to lose all your territory. That is the insane power of People's Army. Even in defense, if you're trying to defend in the most extreme way ever, People's Army still lets Rusviet have a shot at that fight. But just like Billy Mays might say, there's more to the Rusviet Union. So, if their faction abilities was not enough, Rusviet has a few more little tricks up its sleeve. It's one of only 3 factions that has 3 territories adjacent to itself. And besides Polonia, it is the only faction that can actually go onto all 3 of these territories from its home base. If it has the Riverwalk mech, it can Riverwalk straight from its home base onto the food adjacent to its home base. Crimea has 3 territories next to its home base, but one of them is a lake, and Crimea has no opportunity to use it, so that might as well not be there. Polonia has a lake next to its home base, which with Submerge, Polonia can use, but that territory is essentially a blank. Sure, it lets them teleport around and has a little bit of functionality there, but it's essentially a blank. Rusviet's is a valuable territory. It's a farm. You can leave workers there. And it's an encounter. Which means if they get their first mech, they can choose between a speed mech and a Riverwalk mech in order to guarantee their character from home can get an encounter. That's unheard of. Absolutely unheard of. And that's not even the most broken bit. They start on workers. I've established with Crimea. They are the only other one along with Crimea that has a worker start on a village, and so they can produce more workers on their very first action. They also start on metal, which, as I've established with Saxony, is extremely powerful. I believe they are beyond Saxony. They are the only faction. Oh, Albion as well. They are the only factions that start on metal, which means potentially the fastest mechs in the game. But Rusviet can outfast the fastest mechs in the game of the other two because of their faction ability. They can produce. 3 metal, all of their workers, and a star. I already mentioned this, but I need to emphasize that. There are very few boards in the game which cost 4 metal to deploy a mech. And even those that do often have trade as the action above the deploy action. Which means that first produce, 3 produces. Those first 3 produces are going to guarantee you can get a mech. It's going to guarantee you've got all your workers. And then that mech can then reposition all of those workers onto the oil if you want to go for a lot of upgrades, onto the food if you want to go for a lot of enlists. And both of those can synergize depending on which mech you get. So if you get the speed mech, you can position all 8 of your workers spread across between the metal and the oil, as well as move your character all the way out to the encounter without ever upgrading your move action. That's just 2 units, 1 mech, 1, 2, and your character 1, 2, right? So you've optimized your worker positioning onto 2 valuable resources, more metal and more oil, as well as got an encounter. Or if you really want to get the food, as I've already established, and lists are very important early, you go for that Riverwalk mech, you move 7 workers onto food, as well as get the encounter by riverwalking right from your home base onto that encounter. You can then produce a pile of food and then use that over the next several turns to get several enlists. And if that's not enough, once you've got your township mech and your speed mech, your character can, in one move, go from home to the factory. I don't know what to say. They don't have enough significant setbacks to justify all of these benefits. And I even forgot the benefit I mentioned with Saxony, that they cannot be preyed upon in their home base by the most aggressive faction. There's no way Saxony can riverwalk onto this home base. There's a reason why this faction has received the most attention in terms of retroactive nerfs. They've received one combination of board, a player mat, and faction ban. You're not allowed to play industrial with Rusviet. They've also received the specific, I guess it's more of an errata rather than a nerf, although it's not super clear, that they are not allowed to use their faction ability with a factory card. If you are absolutely new to Scythe, or you're teaching somebody who has never played Scythe before, give them Rusviet. It's easier because they don't have to worry about the different columns element, and you've given them a decent number of advantages. If they can figure out how to use them, they might fall in love with the game. So I've decided to save the 2 expansion factions from the Invaders from Afar expansion till the end. The rationale behind this is that they play substantially different from the other factions. Their mech abilities are unique, and their faction abilities involve additional components of the game that aren't seen elsewhere. They're the only factions that do not have a speed mech, as well as the fact that their Riverwalk mechs are modified substantially. Beyond that, their combat-related mechs are in line with those that are available in the other factions. And so, of the 2, Albion and Togawa, I'm going to start by looking at the Albion clan. Represent the British, I suppose, in this era. So the Albion clan's faction ability, as I said, they rely on these extra components. With this, it's the Exalt ability. So after moving their character, they may, if they choose to, place a flag token on that territory. They only receive 4 flag tokens in the entire game, and once a flag token is placed, it is never removed. It stays in that territory for the entire game. Those flag tokens are important because they synergize with their rally mech, which I will talk about shortly, but also those flag tokens represent essentially additional value for endgame scoring. If Albion controls those flag tokens at the end of the game, meaning controls the territory which those flag tokens are on, that territory costs 1 additional territory. There is a caveat to that rule does not apply to their original 2 territories. The 2 territories that their workers start on do not get this benefit if their flag tokens are placed there. So as Albion, you typically want to place your flag tokens the first 4 places you can really get to that aren't your 2 home territories. Oftentimes you might save one for the factory, right? But beyond that, placing them in areas that you can guard and you can be sure you can guard is important to you. Now, why would you want to put one at the factory? Well, let's look at their mech abilities, starting at the last of them. And now we're going to look at all of these. I've kind of skipped a little bit of the mechs on some of the other factions. We're going to look at all of their mech abilities. So, Rally. They don't get speed. Normally, the final mech ability would be speed. Albion gets Rally. They can move to any territory where you have a worker or a flag token. So once you establish a flag token in a location, you now can jump to that location from anywhere, which is important because, again, you do not have 2 movements, which means jumping there from anywhere is your fastest method of moving, even if it's only 2 spaces. But also moving to workers, which means you have this weird leapfrog mechanic you can do where you can use a mech to carry a worker, then use your second of your 3 movements, provided you upgraded it, to move that worker off of that mech spot, and then use a second mech or character to jump to that new worker, allowing you to move to kind of leapfrog around a little bit. And so that's an interesting function that can be played with there, right? So good positioning of your flags in places that you can both hold as well as places that are strategically advantageous is important. Also, if you think the game is about to end, you can use that rally ability to jump to your flags, win a fight if it's being controlled by someone else, get a star, and retain control over it. So, uh, doubly important that you get those flags back. So let's look at their combat related. They have sword and shield, attacking and defending, right? Uh, they, like Saxony, have a potential 2 power swing every time they're involved in combat. If they're on defense, they gain 2 power. If they're on offense, the opponent loses 2 power, right? So that's a benefit, right? Their sword ability is just straight up better than any than uh, Saxony's. It's straight up better than Nordics, right? There's no condition. If I'm attacking, the opponent loses 2 power. I suppose in Saxony's and Nordics, it doesn't explicitly say on attack or defense, so it's a little bit more flexible. But with shield, it kind of balances out. 2 mechs to do what those do less conditionally. And so, they have a bit of a benefit there. They can use those a bit to their advantage to surprise enemies with a potential 4 power swing over 2 turns or something along those lines. Again, the sword mechanic, just as Nordic would use it to potentially deny another player their combat power star, Albion can do so as well, and should often consider that. As well as the fact that the shield mechanic actually allows you to get the combat star before the combat begins, because if you are at, say, 14 power, combat power star, if you're at 14 power and somebody attacks you, you go up to 16 and you get the combat power star before you've had to spend it, right? That's one of the special caveats to the game, but you get it right now, even if you're going to spend some. So, it makes Albion an interesting thing, right? Nobody can really deny you that combat power star once you get high enough. And actually, you become a little bit immune to combat if people are reticent to attack you to try and deny you that. So, taking advantage of that unique position can be an interesting strategy. Burrow is probably my favorite of the Riverwalk abilities because of its flexibility. You can Riverwalk as long as you're moving to or from a tunnel. And almost all Riverwalks in the game are to or from tunnels, right? So this doesn't come up too often. It comes up that Albion can cross over to Polonia's peninsula, specifically onto their encounter location. So if there isn't a Polonia in the game, which Albion always prays for, then they have a little bit more space to work with. On the other side, they can go from their home encounter on their village over to the oil and maybe even back to Nordic's peninsula. So while they're slow, they can kind of creep almost anywhere on the board through Burrow. If Albion was given a speed mech, Burrow would be definitely borderline too strong as an ability, which is why if an Albion manages to march their way all the way to the factory and get that, they've got some serious power in their pocket. Now let's look at Albion's starting position. So Albion, just like the other forgotten, just like the other invaders from afar faction, doesn't have a starting peninsula. They are connected to the mainland. Very, very, just by one small connection, that oil to that metal there at the bottom of the screen, they can walk their way on out to the factory. But that connection is not insignificant. That means that, if they continue to move, they can continue marching to the factory with nothing stopping them. So that's not an uncommon strategy for an Albion, is just every turn try to get closer to the factory with nothing to stop you. You also can get some encounters along the way and place some flags, which is important to you, right? And so that's something to consider. Also, Albion has all of the most important resources at home, right? They have a village, which they do have to fight a little bit with Nordic for, but they almost never lose it. They've got metal as a starting location, as I talked about with Rusviet. Metal means to producing metal on your first turn means that one of the earliest mechs you can get, which is very important to strategic movement as well as holding your position. And starting on food. Enlist, I can't say it enough, Enlist is the strongest bottom row action, objectively, or subjectively rather. And so those are great things to start on, as well as you've got 2 encounters within 2 moves of your starting position rather than 1. Now, that oil one you're often fighting with Polonia for, but 2 encounters is greater than 1. So if an Albion even does just manage to kind of build a wall around those 4 territories, their village, their farm, their mountains, and their tundra, build a wall around that, hold it, defend it, protect it, right? Then Albion has all the resources they theoretically can need for the whole game. And if you can mix in a couple moves and get some mechs out to closer to the factory, then there's some real potential for Albion to have an interesting position. My biggest weakness on Albion is that if I have a board that, say, has 2 or 3 coins associated with the build ability, I overly focus on trying to get to that wood on the opposite side of that lake, and that isn't the best idea. You know, getting out there is good, but focusing on getting workers there and trying to actually do an economy game out there is very risky. It's right between 2 tunnels. It's directly adjacent to the factory. It's directly adjacent to 3 different lakes, which means Polonia has some potential to attack them, and so does Nordic, because Nordic's got that lake walk, and those lakes are close to Nordic. So Albion being so tightly packed in there, often statistically in the base game of just Invaders from Afar and vanilla Scythe, does have the lowest win rates. And that might have to be with the fact that they also start with no combat cards. So if they do get involved in early combats before they have an opportunity to generate combat cards, they have a bit of a disadvantage. So, you know, playing Albion is all about trying to find that right economy and acquire those territories that you can double up on and hold them. So, last but not least in this video that has ended up being substantially longer than I intended it to be, is the Togawa Shogunate, the second of the 2 Invaders from Afar. So Togawa represents Japan, not too surprisingly, and they are, just like Albion, substantially different from the base 5 factions. Again, they have a token-based system similar to Albion's flags. Their faction ability, and I might say this wrong, Maifoku, right? After moving your character, you may place an armed trap token on its territory. So Togawa starts with 4 trap tokens. On one side, they show Togawa's faction symbol, and on the other side, they say one of 4 negative penalties, right? The 4 penalties are as follows. Lose 4 coins, lose 3 power, lose 2 combat cards, chosen at random, and lose 2 popularity. So when Togawa moves their character, they can choose to put down one of those face down. The opponents do not know which trap is which. And when an opponent enters territory with a trap, the trap triggers. So you flip it upright, the trap is now disarmed, and the opponent immediately takes the penalty. There are a few interesting caveats to that. If, you know, for instance, a Polonia were to trigger the -2 popularity trap when attacking a Togawa mech or character, they actually would not lose the popularity because it is in combat. I know that does not exactly synergize with what Polonia's faction ability says, which is when forcing workers to retreat, but I believe there was an errata established on the Board Game Geek subreddits that established that as a standard rule, that they do not lose popularity in that context either. Beyond that, I think mostly it is fairly straightforward as to how they lose it. The other benefit of the trap tokens is that if they are alone and armed in a territory at the end of the game, that territory counts as under Togawa control for end game scoring. So if Togawa manages to move their character around the board enough to place enough of these tokens in areas that they no longer want or need, Togawa can gain up to 4 bonus territories of a control for bonus points at the end of the game. And as I've already established before, and I will talk about more in a future video, endgame territories are probably the most valuable element of your final turns of the game. And so getting those throughout is important. They also act as a wonderful deterrent to enemy aggression. If you manage to get one onto the factory, then you might be able to hold the factory with just simply one mech or character, probably your character, right? Because a 2 popularity loss is quite significant. A 2 card loss can be extremely important. A 3 power loss, plus perhaps the Ronin mech for a 5 power swing in a combat, can completely change a game. So they are not something to be overlooked. So their mech abilities also synergize a bit with that just like Albion's do. So rather than a speed wet mech, they have the Shinobi mech. So just like Albion, when they place these flag tokens, they now have the ability to move directly to those territories as if they were adjacent. So these traps are doubly important as for area control, as for actually triply important. They're area control for endgame scoring. They are defensive measures as a attack deterrent, and also they are a movement function to allow you to reposition yourself out onto a board should you lose a mech or need to reposition because of other circumstances. But additionally, you may arm that trap when you move to it. So if an opponent does trigger a trap, you can rearm it. Now, there is the weakness that once it's been triggered, everyone in the game now knows what it is. Lest they forget, right? And so, but it can still act as that deterrent. Oh, you saw a character lose 2 cards, and then you re-enable that trap later on. Now, other people know to go there, they have to lose 2 cards, or lose 2 power, or 3 power, or lose 2 pop. And that's often a cost that's not worth the loss, the control. So taking advantage of your traps and then using them, important. Their aggressive abilities on their mechs are some of the most awkward in the game. Ronin. Before combat where you have exactly 1 unit, gain 2 power. So workers count as units. You can't have a mech with a few workers and get that ability. It has to be a lone mech or a lone character. Now, as already established, if your character is walking alone out to the factory or has gotten there and is now moving around and maybe trying to get a few last encounters, it has some value there, especially in conjunction with the lose 3 power trap. There's a 5 power swing that can be had there. But it's only 1 card. So, sure, you gain 2 power, but you only can spend 1 card. Having a second unit is a second card, which is at least 2 power, a minimum thereof 2 power. So there is a strangeness to it. Anytime you have the potential to attack, if you can do so with and think you can win with just a one unit, then you have that slight surprise of, ooh, I got 2 extra power. And you can also even use that benefit to, as I mentioned with Albion, hit that combat power star before a combat starts. If you're at 14 power, you can move to attack someone and use Ronin to gain the last 2 power to get the combat power star before you attack them and spend all your power to win and get a second star. So that's an interesting way to go for a 2-star turn. Or even 3 if you can go for 2 different combats. There's Scythe mech. Move to and from lakes, and then if they have combat on a lake, they may play 1 additional card. Now, I established with Rusviet that playing an additional card is bonkers. It is absolutely bonkers in power. But it's only on lakes. Who are you fighting? Nordic? Sometimes, because Nordic retreating onto lakes, you have that interesting thing that if you fight them on the lake, they can't retreat, so you can use this and get some combats there. A Togawa in the game means that they can kind of limit the mobility of a Polonia and prevent that Polonia from getting maybe 2 encounters that they otherwise would over near the Rusviet side of the board. But Scythe is very, very seldom one of the first mechs you get. It's almost always the last mech. The Riverwalk mech is also an interesting one. and also plays into the fact that their mobility is quite low. Toka, move across a river with a maximum of one character or mech per turn, which means they can't move multiple units across a river or even different rivers, right? Only one river can be crossed by one unit per turn for Togawa, right? But they can do so anywhere, which means Togawa has the potential to get that encounter that's in Rusviet's home base. They have the ability to get the encounter that's in Crimea's home peninsula, as long as their character's close enough. So, in Togawa, you really want to start marching your character out into the map, hopefully your first turn, if not your second turn, because you move slow, and you want to march them out, get that factory, get those tokens out, get across the rivers and take those encounters where you can, if they're not in the game, or if you can do it before they get to it, which is very unlikely. So that's really what Toka is for. And then if you can use it with the factory card, power to you. You're very unlimited in how you cross rivers. You might think that maximum one character or mech per turn is going to be a big restriction, but as it turns out, you seldom need to cross more than one. Rivers don't get crossed often, except for the one that you need to cross at your home peninsula, and Togawa does not have a home peninsula. Which brings us to Togawa's board position, which is very interesting, to say the least. So looking at Togawa's board position, their starting position, again, like Albion, they are not locked into just a peninsula. They are free to move about the main majority of the board the entire game. Unlike Albion, their home area is essentially 5 territories rather than 4. And they have 2 different routes to go around to the factory. Plus, if they get the Toka Lake, technically, they can go right over that lake as well. There is a faster route and a slower route, but there's flexibility there. This home area, meaning there are 2 starting territories, the 2 adjacent territories, and I might even consider that wood to be part of it because that wood often goes overlooked, means that you have access to every type of basic land unit, the land territory, to use as you please. So that is strong. But now let's look at specifically what they start with. What's your turn 1 might look like? We've established that starting on oil is always great. Early produces mean early upgrades, mean a more efficient engine throughout the rest of the game. So starting on oil is awesome. Leaving your worker there has potential. Then you start on food. Enlist is the strongest action. I can say it so many times. Enlist is the strongest bottom row action. Gaining benefits for every action you do in the future, gaining benefits for every action your opponents do, and they need to do them to be beating you, which means that they're making you better by being better. Enlist is the strongest bottom row action. Then metal being the next adjacent for both of them means that it's not hard to get onto metal to start making mechs, which again, mechs are important for defense, they're important for area control, they're important for mobility. So those core 3 are important. What makes Togawa awkward is the location of the village. You want to get a worker onto that village to get more workers, to try and take advantage of this economy area you can really use. Well, the most logical way to do it is to move your worker off of your food. But then you can't get that enlist anymore. Or if you do a double shift and move your oil one to food and your food one to the village, well, then you're not mobilizing your character. And you're losing your oil for upgrades. Not a good decision. And even if you do get workers onto that village to create a lot more workers, well, what are you going to do about it? Right? You don't have a mech to move them, and even if you did, your mechs only move one space. You don't have a speed mech. Right? So that's where Togawa gets awkward, right? Is what's the play? What should I do? Right? In my experience, you want to try and focus on whatever action is tied to move, as well as whatever action is tied to produce. Hopefully neither of them is tied to build. Because you're going to want to produce to get the resources, you're going to want to move to get your character out there, placing traps, getting to the factory, potentially taking advantage of Toka to get more encounters. So that's generally what you want to do on Togawa. If those actions are tied to upgrade or enlist, great. If you can squeeze a deploy in there somewhere, maybe off of your encounter, man, you're looking good. Beyond that, though, things get awkward. Structures, again, odd. Going for that building, the structure bonus tile, maybe. But, namely, moving and whatever's tied to produce, and hopefully one of those are involved with not building. Although you can make it work as a builder on Togawa. Definitely possible. Togawa, in my experience, has some of the strongest economy in the game. The encounter get rich or die trying or cry trying is a very easy one to get on Togawa. Getting 20 coins, in my experience, is not difficult. Once you establish yourself in the right place, doing a upgrade to do the gain for 2 coins rather than a move just has an interesting way of essentially making things worth it that wouldn't otherwise be worth it. So if you're looking to try and figure out a cool economy game, try playing Togawa a lot. So this video ended up being substantially longer than I originally intended, and so I'm going to move any discussion of the individual player mats and their interesting combinations and synergies to another video, and so you should look out for my second video. I also plan on doing a third video that covers some general strategy elements of decisions to make in the middle and end game, how to look for specific end game decisions if a game is going to end, and what you should do about it. As well as any other elements that might come up. So look for that in the future, and I hope you enjoyed. If you really are into Scythe and maybe you don't get enough chance to play in person, you should definitely check out the Tabletop Simulator. There is a excellent DLC for it, as well as a amazingly scripted mod built by Azor Ahai. I cannot recommend it enough. And there's a very active Discord community that's tied to that specific mod. We do a great job at tracking stats and finding our way balance, and we're also, developing a lot of fan-made content. So I encourage you to, look into that, and hopefully I'll see you on that Discord sometime. Cheers.